2E is sign diagram. Don't forget your stat box. So remember that a sign diagram is a number line showing when the function is positive, negative, or zero. It can also indicate where the function is undefined. So again, we briefly did this in chapter 1, so if you don't remember it that clearly, that's okay. We might have a number line and say we've got 5, and then we would tell where it was positive or negative on that number line. So we did it just a little bit with the discriminant. What we're going to add to it is that in addition to showing where it's 0, like right here it's 0 at 5 in this one that I just made up, we can also show where it is undefined. And so we'll have a little mark on our graph that instead of using a line, we're going to use like a little dotted line. Kind of in like reverse, we are going to talk about like how we can do this graphically, and then we'll talk about how we can do it algebraically. Alright, so like I said, we're going to first look at the graph. So we're going to draw a sign diagram for this graph. So we've got a linear function here. This was before I learned how to use projector mode on Desmos, so I know the line is kind of skinny. Can you guys still see it? So when we make our number line, we really start by looking at the x's to figure out what we put on our number line. We start by looking at the x's and figure out, okay, what numbers do I put on the number line? Now I look at this and I notice that our function is 0, the y is 0, the output is 0 at -2. So I'm going to put -2 on my number line. So whenever the y value is 0, that's what you put on your number line. And then, to figure out if it's positive or negative, we're looking at the output, so we'll look at our y values to determine if it's positive or negative. So it kind of divides it up into the left side of -2 and the right side of -2. So look on the left side of -2, are my y values positive or negative over here? My y values? Positive? Okay, I put a plus sign on the left side. And if I look at the right side of -2, are these y values positive or negative? Over here, the right side, my y values. I'm hoping you can see negative. I had a couple voices out there. So that'll be negative. And that is our sign diagram. We're going to look at some that get a little bit more complex, but I just wanted to start with a basic one. Are there questions? Okay. So then, here's another one. In this case, we've got a parabola. Once again, we'll start looking at our x-axis to look at where it says y equals 0. So when I look at my x-axis, y equals 0 here at -1 and y equals 0 at 3. So I'll put these on my sign diagram. So I'm looking at the x-axis for the zeros, and I put those zeros on my number line. And then in this case, since I have 2 zeros, it kind of splits my graph up into 3 different sections. So one section is to the left of -1. When x is less than -1, are these y's positive or negative? positive, so we'll put a plus sign to the left of -1 on my number line. Then I'm split up into the middle in between -1 and 3. So in this section, between -1 and 3, are my y's positive or negative? So I'll put a minus sign. Are we doing okay? This is good, right? And then when I look to the right side of 3, I've got positives, so I can put a plus sign. Now we are going to look at one that has some undefined areas next, so we know how to handle undefined on our sign diagram. Are there any questions? Anything you're confused about? Okay. So now we have like a rational function here. Now we noticed, kind of like when we were looking at domain and range on Tuesday, we've got an asymptote here. It looks like getting really, really close to -2, but not quite getting there. So now, when I look at my x-axis, I notice that I have a 0 at 5. So I'm going to put a mark at 5. But then I also have this asymptote going on at x equals -2. Now I don't want to put like a normal mark because that means a 0. This isn't a 0. Y does not equal 0 here. So I'm just going to put like a little dashed line for -2. So that's how we can tell the difference between I've got a 0, I've got like my normal hash mark, but if I have a dashed line, that's my asymptote. That's where the function is undefined. There is no answer for y at that spot. But in the same way, I've got everything divided into these different sections. So if I look to the right of -2, all these are negative down here. So I've got negatives. If I look between -2 and 5, so between my asymptote and that 0, 5, all of these y's are positive. And then if I look to the right side of 5, I know they're just slightly negative, but all of these y's here are negative. We are going to switch to how we can figure these out algebraically next, but are there any other questions about graphically? Like looking at the graph for y being positive or negative, or how to find your numbers on your number line. And now I know a lot of times it goes like this, like minus, plus, minus, like it kind of follows that pattern, but it's not that way all the time, so don't like get in the habit and just like skip it, especially when we get to this algebraic stuff, because for the algebraic stuff we don't have a picture. So what we want to do then is we want to solve for x. To find that 0, we want to solve for x, so we'll have to figure out, okay, when our function equals 0, what does x equal? That'll find the 0. And then we also want to find where the function is undefined, just like we did when we worked on domain. So we have to do those two things. Solve our function, looking for those zeros, and then looking for where it's undefined. After we do that, after we find how many points are going to be on our number line, and it might be 1, it might be 2, it might be 3, then I want to choose values and then substitute in them to decide if it's going to be positive or negative. Now I know that those directions are kind of disconnected, but it will go through all of these steps on our next two examples. Alright, so the directions are still the same. Draw a sign diagram for the function. In this case, our function is x plus 1 and x minus 4. So we end up having to do two things. We have to look for the zeros, and we have to look for where our function is undefined. So, what do you want me to do first? Which one? Nobody cares? Zeros first? Okay. So, whenever you do the zeros, you set your function equal to 0, whatever it is. So I'm going to take that, set it equal to 0. If it's a linear function, it says 2x plus 3, set that equal to 0, whatever it happens to be. And every function will have a different way to solve it. If it's a linear function, I know you've got your inverse operations down. You can solve it that way. The next one's going to be a quadratic, so we'll talk about that. What about this, though? I can see like two similar but different strategies to solving this. Does anyone have a suggestion or what they might try? Gotta figure out what x is. So I think that maybe you guys would like this. I don't know. Like, what if I made that into like a fraction, which is a really weird fraction, 0 over 1. But then what would you do? What would that make you think of? Yeah, cross multiply. So when I cross multiply, 1 times x plus 1 is just x plus 1. And what happens when I do x minus 4 times 0? It's 0. Okay? I know that you guys know this stuff. I do. Another strategy, I don't want to confuse you, but you could just multiply by this on both sides. You end up with the same result. So you want to get that out of the denominator, but when you multiply by 0, it's 0. So that's just another thing that came up. So now when I solve it, I get x equals negative 1. So that is my 0. So I'll put a mark on my number line. I'm not drawing my number line yet, but I'll put a mark there on my number line. Now, as far as when the function is undefined, remember I have to look for two things. Is there any square rooting? And then is there any dividing? So do I have any square rooting happening? Hope y'all can say no. There are no square roots up there. I am dividing, so we know that this cannot be 0. So remember, we would figure out, okay, what is that value? So x minus 4 equals 0. So when I add that over, x equals 4 is where my function is undefined. I can't divide by 0. So now when I draw my number line, I have got to put a little hash mark at negative 1. 4 is where it's undefined, so I'm going to do a little dotted line at 4. Now here's where we have to pick some numbers. So because we don't have a picture, we can't look at a graph to see where it's positive or negative. We're going to pick numbers in each of those sections and then plug them in to see what we get. So I need you guys to pick a number that is less than negative 1. That would be over here. Negative 2. Okay. So we'll plug in negative 2 to our original function and see what happens. So if I plug it in, I've got negative 2 plus 1 over negative 2 minus 4. And I'm really just looking to find out, do I get a positive answer or a negative answer? So now I end up with negative 1 over negative 6. Well, those negatives cancel out. So it's positive 1/6. So I'll put a plus sign in that section. If I get a negative answer, I put a minus sign. If I get a positive answer, I put a plus sign in that section. After we do that, then we pick a number in between negative 1 and 4. So any number that would fall in here between negative 1 and 4. 2 fits, I'm going to pick a different one, but you can do 2, and you'll get the right answer. I'm going to pick 0. 0 just like is nice and easy. But you could pick 2. You could pick 1/2 if you wanted to. You could pick the square root of 2 if you wanted to. Anything that falls in between there. And so I'm picking 0. This is one of my favorites. I always pick it if I can. So 0 plus 1 over 0 minus 4 gives me 1 over negative 4. That is negative. So I'll put a minus sign. And then here, I can pick something. So I can pick 5, I can pick 10, I can pick 100. Let's just go with 5. So 5 plus 1 over 5 minus 4. 6 over 1, which is positive. So that will give me that plus sign there. Any questions or concerns? All right, let me just have one last example like this, just so you guys can feel pretty good going into your assignment. Negative x squared plus 6x minus 9.
Interruption. Please allow students from the theater back in your room. The assembly is over with. They should be back in a few minutes.
Same thing, we look for where our function is undefined and what are the zeros. So let's just start with undefined. Do I have any square rooting? Nope. Do I have any dividing? So I don't even have to worry about that. It's not undefined. So I won't have any like dash marks on mine at all. Now for the zeros, I have to set that equal to 0. So negative x squared plus 6x minus 9 equals 0. It's a good thing we just finished a chapter on quadratics, right? So if you really like to do quadratic formula, I suggest you do quadratic formula. Like if you hate factoring, do quadratic formula. If you could complete the square if you really wanted to, that would work out just fine. I'm going to factor it if you don't mind. Is that okay? So I can take out this negative 1. And then I can jump right down to those 2 parentheses. But actually, no, I can't. What am I doing? That's going to change that to positive x squared minus 6x plus 9. Now I can jump to my 2 parentheses. Factors of 9 that combine to get negative 6. And because it's a negative 6, I have to have minus 3 and minus 3. Again, if you hate factoring, do quadratic formula. Now if I split these all up, I notice something. This negative 1 equals 0 is not going to give me any solutions, right? Now if these are both the same, I don't really need to do them both. I only end up with x equals 3 as my only 0. So that means there's only going to be one thing on my number line, 3. So then once again, we've got to pick numbers that fit on either side. Are we okay? So for a number that's less than 3, I'm going to go with 0 because that's going to be so cute. This is 0, this is 0. It equals negative 9. So that's a negative. Someone in my second hour suggested I plug in 100, and I said that was just too much. But let's say I plug in 10, because 10 is greater than 3. I just kind of want to show you we can pick any number. So if I do that, keep in mind that 10 squared is 100, but this negative sign is outside of that. So I have negative 100 plus 60 minus 9. Now, with my mental math, I don't really feel like getting an answer for that, but can you guys tell if that's going to be positive or negative? Negative, right? Negative 100 is way more than a positive 60. So whatever it is, it's going to be negative. So there I go with negative. Are there any questions? Alright. Your step box is just any hints you have for yourself. So anything that you, any hints, like anything that you take a look at for this stuff. And then there's your assignment.